Okay, so in the second part, we're going to look at a different theorist who had a very different way of looking at socialization. So if you remember when we covered the theory of interactionism or symbolic interactionism, you might want to look over that as a way of understanding Goffman, because that's the school of thought that he's coming from. So he's really looking at the socialization process on the micro level, say 3, 4, 5 people, small groups, and how does one understand how to be a social person given certain dynamics. So for Goffman, this sort of presentation of self theory is the idea that given the context, the people that are there, knowing how to be social, knowing how to present oneself is going to differ from one situation to the next. And so really the sort of dynamics of interactions is really essential in trying to show how one understands who they are as a person in society. Goffman, as sort of the overarching focus of his work, is he's interested in what people do. He's looking at human behavior. How do people know what to do? And he always looks at the empirical world, or what we would call what we can observe, right? So there's different methodologies. Goffman was definitely interested in what can we see. If we look at these sort of interaction dynamics, we always have to start with observing them first, and then once you observe them, then you can start to abstract a little bit and begin to theorize as to what and how do we explain human behavior. So really it's in the moment. He's interested, remember, in every context and every different set of people is going to produce a different kind of social dynamic. So it's really in the moment and in the interaction that he's precisely interested in. So there's 3 parts to the sort of presentation of self in everyday life. How does one become social? The first one is known as impression management. These are the things that we do to manage our impressions we make on others, especially to reduce tension. So anytime you're introducing yourself, you are managing your impression. You want to give off a certain kind of image to the people that you meet. And again, this is going to change from situation to situation. So if, say, you are at a restaurant and you're meeting a friend of a friend for the first time, and the way that you present yourself is probably going to be pretty informal and not a whole lot of tension. But say you are walking in on a new job, and you're being introduced to your boss, and this is the first time you've met this person, or whatever, or you're trying to get a job. So this sort of presentation itself is going to be full of tension, because you're really going to try to come across as responsible, a good worker, and there's a lot at stake in how you present who you are. So impression management is what kind of impression do we want to make on others, and any way that we can do that to reduce tension, we are going to try to do that. The way people communicate, usually with tension, is that we pretend not to notice. Instead, we give off symbols and meanings without being direct. Say, you've got like a piece of bread on your face, and somebody wants to tell you that that's there, and they don't want to call you out, they don't want to make a big deal out of it, so they might do some sort of nonverbal way of telling you. These are, again, a way to reduce tension. You want to come across as a nice person. You're going to do things that hopefully communicate that. So we are always trying to consciously make ourselves look good and maximize the returns to impress others in order to reap the benefits of the interaction. And this is really important, because in any sort of human interaction, this is true, that we not only are trying to present our best self, but we're doing it in such a way that the return will be equal to that. So if I give off a good impression, hopefully that person will receive that and return it with some sort of understanding and some sort of positive reaction. And this is what we're trying to do in this sort of dynamic. Goffman found that people try to present themselves in an idealized way. In other words, they present the best self possible while concealing things that are not ideal. So, in any situation where we're trying to present, our best self, we maybe talk a certain way, we dress a certain way, we carry ourselves in a way that might be very different than, say, the way that we act around our good friends or our parents. It's a very different kind of presentation itself. And we do that too at the same time, concealing the things that aren't ideal. So maybe, maybe you're trying to get this job and you might want to conceal that you're not the most organized person in the world. So you might want to conceal that in some way, coming across as very responsible as a way to kind of submerge the unidealized self. And again, it just depends on the desired impression that we want. So if we want to sort of maximize returns, we're going to present a maximized, idealized self. If it's not important to us, if, say, you're being introduced to an 8-year-old, it's not going to be a big deal if that person, if that kid doesn't like you, or something like that. There's going to be a range of how much we're going to desire this sort of reaction. Okay, the second thing that Goffman was interested in is role distance. And role distance is, again, this is a micro level, where people try to separate themselves from the negative roles that they're in. And we constantly do this. You can see on different levels, say class. Class is a big thing, where people sit in the socioeconomic structure. If they're very poor, or even if they're very rich, they're going to try to separate themselves from that in a way that they can still be acceptable to the group. You can see this is especially true of adolescents when they're trying to make friends and try to come off as cool. They're really going to try to separate themselves from any negative roles that they're in. I mean, maybe they come from a single-parent home, or maybe their sister is a mean person. They're going to try to separate themselves as much as possible. So if something is, negative, you're going to distance yourself and show that this is not as important as it needs to be. You're going to try to step away from it. The third thing he looked at is this issue of stigma, and that's the gap between what people ought to be and what they're actually like. Stigma can be anything from, say, like a stutter, or maybe a physical disability, or anything that we wish we were sort of a normative self, and we're trying to overcome that gap between what people consider to be ideal or normal, and in the ways that we're not. We're trying to close that gap as much as possible. So a discredited stigma is something that's obvious to the audience, and for Goffman, he often thought of human interaction like a stage. We're actors on a stage. But at any rate, so a discredited stigma is something that's very obvious, something that, of course, the moment you meet that person, you know what the stigma is. A discreditable stigma is something that's not obvious, so that through the process of interaction, people find out something about you that is not obviously a stigma. So through interaction, you find this out. And we will do anything to alter or pass in order to relieve forms of stigma. I mean, Goffman's very interested in this idea of tension. How do we reduce it? And so we'll try to maybe pretend it's not there, or pass in a way that makes it seem like, okay, even though you have a stigma, it doesn't seem like it's that important. So again, with Goffman, sort of to close up, he is interested in symbolic interaction, the way that we make meaning between 3 or 4 people in a small group. And so he really has sort of a micro approach to this sort of human action. So social reality, the sort of society that we have, is created through interaction. The way that we become aware of ourselves in society is through interaction. If we were just ourselves alone in a room, it would be very hard to understand society and what society is about. So really, interaction is key in understanding that. And it's done in the everyday life. whether we're going to the grocery store or hanging out with our friends at the beach, or all these different things that we do on a daily basis all sort of create a social reality. Often these behaviors, these sort of social behaviors, are taken for granted, but we know things that are sort of taken for granted, we realize that they are the moment that it's broken. So we break a social rule, we understand the importance of the rules. And any sort of small group interaction, you'll see rules being broken. Like somebody will say something that's maybe too mean, and somebody will have to correct that person and say, look, you're being too harsh, So we're constantly correcting ourselves as a way to fit into this understanding, this shared understanding of what is acceptable in society. So the sort of everydayness helps us understand not only the interconnections that we have, but it can also be a way of comparing. So a small group of peers versus, say, a business organization. These interconnections are going to be very different. How do we compare one with the other? Okay, so as the last part of this lecture, I want you to do a lecture-based assignment, and I want you to come up with an example of impression management, role distance, and stigma, just like you did for social construction. Come up with an example for each of these. How would you explain impression management using an example, and you can think of one on your own, and then come up with an example of role distance, and then finally stigma. And then how would someone resolve interactionally, either your example of role distance or stigma? So remember, go over what these are and then come up with an example of each. And then if you're in this small group, right, and you have an example of role distance or stigma, how would someone resolve the tension interactionally with either role distance or stigma?